Herbie's hippopotamus. I don't know if anyone has seen the documentary Herbert's Hippopotamus, which is about Marcuse's life and work. I think Roger put a link to it on the dreaded Intermedia. For all those who haven't, the reason I brought her with me tonight is that Marcuse himself was fascinated by hippopotamuses. He saw them as creatures who stretch the boundaries of possibility, which is what his theory is all about, essentially. His office was filled with models of them. So, so my hippopotamus friend has come to bring us some luck and help liberate our imaginations tonight. Okay.
What's her name?
Oh, I'm working on it. Everyone will have to bear with me as well, because as those who all have been to previous talks know, I'm not great at relating to people or talking to people. And I've tended to rely on a rigid script for that reason, because I have problems with social interaction. But I've decided to do without that today and just give myself guidelines, so please bear with me if I get a bit lost. So when I was preparing for this talk and making plans for the workshop, I was talking about it to Roger, and he asked me if I was assuming I'd be speaking to people who were already anti-capitalists. So I thought about that, and I said vegans are already going to be resistant to authority. And this is what separates them from those folks who follow a plant-based diet for other than ethical reasons, because vegans are already engaged in critical thinking on a very important level. Our daily choices are part of the Great Refusal. So I think I'm right in assuming I'm speaking to people who believe, as I do, in the possibility of real revolutionary change. Of interest, how many anti-capitalists do we have here?
Yes.
Some undecided. So, yeah, in this talk, I want to examine a few aspects of Marcuse's thought and writings, and particularly how I interpret the message of his Great Refusal concept, in terms of the use of language and its impact on critical thinking. Among the things I want to discuss are my understanding of the Great Refusal as a rejection of the world that is in favour of the creation by revolutionary action of the world that should be. Also the need for the liberation of our imaginations from the prison that is capitalism and the possibilities this creates. I'll attempt to put Marcuse's idealistic opposition to capitalism in the context of the complex oppressions we face today. And with this in mind, I want to touch on some varied issues, among them repressive tolerance and consumer culture as social control. And when we've got through all that, I want to explain my emphatic rejection of the division we've created between theory and practice, and why I view the opposition which many activists perceive between the two as being counter-revolutionary. That's one thing I'm expecting not to be very popular, because historically it hasn't been. So it should be interesting to see what we all think about it anyway. So some background. Marcuse was a refugee from the Nazi regime and a disillusioned ex-Marxist searching for new revolutionaries when he wrote most of his major works. I say ex-Marxist, yet this is not absolutely accurate, since he never explicitly rejected Marxist theory, only thought far beyond its narrow confines, and became one of the fiercest critics of the betrayal of its ideals he saw in oppressive communist regimes. To give you some idea of how disillusioned he must have been when he was thinking through everything we're going to discuss our own oppression in light of today, he'd seen German socialists cheer for a war that killed millions of young working class people. He'd seen capitalism tottering in the crisis which followed this war, without any sign of the united proletarian revolutionary force which Marx had prophesied, rising up to give it the final hard push that would turn it into history. And as a member of the Revolutionary Soldiers' Council in Berlin, he had watched in despair as old leaders were re-elected, and all hope of a new world, or even a new vision, were docilely given away. Yet Marcuse refused to give up hope. To me, he was an idealist whose ideals were betrayed and disappointed repeatedly, yet he retained his belief in idealism as an essential component of the revolutionary process, and his belief in the transformative power of an alternative vision which is pursued without apology, without hypocrisy, and without compromise. So, the definition I like most of all the definitions he wrote of the Great Refusal is one where he's speaking of the power of language to oppress or liberate, and calling for systematic linguistic rebellion against the violent and exploitative status quo. And on this theme, he writes of the language of negation as the great refusal to accept the rules of a game in which the dice are loaded. As you can imagine, my literal little mind took a while with the dice metaphor, but I worked it out. And so this definition became, for me, the one that resonates with me most. I think the reason that is leads us straight into one of the aspects of Marcuse's thoughts which I most identify with, and that's his rejection of reformism, which I find is a large element of the Great Refusal theory. So this definition, as a refusal to accept the rules of the game, expresses the anger I feel when revolution is right in front of us, and instead, time after time, we choose reform. We're disillusioned before we've even tried. We capitulate and we pick up the dice to play the system's game. What we don't understand when we do this, and I'm going to digress here, we do it in so many different ways, and the tragedy is so many different ways which we conceive of as revolutionary, because they are presented to us as revolutionary. For example, we hold protests outside a shop, and the cops arrive and tell us, oh, you can't protest there, you've got to protest 3 yards away, so that you're not guilty of willful obstruction. Fine, we all move back and we protest there instead of there. And that makes this enormous, huge difference. Basically, there's been this place, this niche created for self-styled revolutionaries in this society where no revolution is possible. And capitalism is quite happy to have us in that niche. We don't shake anything up while we're in there. And that's the result, that's the cause of all this nitpicking over stand there, don't stand there. We're going to go into this in more depth in a workshop people have expressed interest in participating in about direct action and civil disobedience, in which I want to include a critique of protest within the law, how effective it is, and stuff like that. But anyway, there are all sorts of ways, and I'm sure we can all think of ways where we've bought into the game. And what we don't understand when we do this, to return to what I was saying, is that a patchwork vision, stitched together from bits of ours and bits of theirs, can never make a new world. Nothing made in the spirit of compromise, submission and acceptance can ever be compatible with the spirit of revolution. And when we make our elaborate plans to appeal to the mainstream, when we try to dress and act and speak as society wants so we will be heard, when we attempt to influence politicians instead of rejecting their power to make decisions for us, we compromise, we submit, we accept. We finally get our message heard in the halls of power, not even knowing those halls could have been reduced to rubble if we had rebelled instead of bargaining. And there is nothing left worth hearing when we get that message heard. Audre Lorde was so right when she said the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And I, for one, can't believe that we're still trying. We've been at it long enough, and it's obvious to all of us the master's house is still standing. So I think, for me, that is a huge part of the Great Refusal message. It doesn't stop at socially accepted forms of protest. In fact, one thing that Marcuse was very clear on when he defined and spoke about the Great Refusal is that political protest had to enter previously apolitical genres. He was speaking about art as activism in that context, but I completely believe that these confines are created for us and we operate inside of them, so nothing will ever change. And one thing that helps me understand the revolutionary potential of the Great Refusal is when I think about it in terms of my own life. The Great Refusal is, in its essence, about transcending socially constructed perceptions, rejecting the inevitability of forms of so-called reality imposed by the system and the violence inherent in that system, and embracing the creative possibilities that critical thinking opens up for us in our struggle. And I know and feel how far away from that kind of liberation I still am. When, for example, I'm in a safe place having a beautiful day with someone I love and trust, and part of my mind says to me, this isn't real, this isn't the way the world really is. So, it's like I can't believe in it. But I'm with Marcuse on this one. I refuse to let violence define my reality, and I refuse to let it define me. I reject the defeatist notion of the world as an inevitably violent and unfair place. I believe, as Marcuse did, that we exist through the revolutionary act of transforming our world. I believe utopia is necessary, and what makes it impossible is our belief, carefully fostered by the establishment, in its impossibility. So that is one aspect of the Great Refusal that I still struggle to live up to personally, but I'm working on it. Another concept which I wanted to explore with everybody here is Marcuse's concept of the liberated imagination. How does that fit into this? Essentially, what Marcuse meant when he spoke of the necessity of liberating our imaginations is that we cannot create what we cannot conceive of. The new sensibility, as he puts it himself, on which total revolution depends, will be guided and shaped by the liberated imagination, rather than by our experiences of repression under previous conditions. But what does this mean? Does it mean we need to free our imaginations from the death grip of our history, which is an endless cycle of violence and oppression? It necessarily does. How do we do this? And can the imagination be truly liberated only in the context of revolution, since, as Marcuse points out, it is fed by the senses? That's what makes up the imagination. So if our imaginations are so conditioned and so confined and receiving this constant bombardment of repression and brainwashing and violence, how do we resist all that? The Great Refusal is the refusal to let ourselves, and as a consequence of that, our world, be defined by all this repression. How do we do it? An imagination freed from the confines of our tragic history, an imagination which rejects the notion of capitalism and hierarchy as inevitable, an imagination that can create radical alternatives not stunted by the socially imposed morality of the establishment, is a necessary precondition for revolution. We can't have a revolution without it, because we are not revolutionaries without it. We bring oppression to our revolutions and we kill them. And an excellent example of this, if everyone will tolerate the digression, is that discussion on indie media, which I'm sure some of you were watching with horror. Because self-styled revolutionaries bring all this internalised oppression, all these forms of privilege which are so obnoxious and so counter-revolutionary, and they bring that to their revolution. And so there's no change. They are replicating the pattern. We're all replicating the pattern. So can this necessary precondition for revolution, can this imagination only be born in a world where real revolution has become possible? I hesitate to call this a chicken and egg situation, in case that's speciesist, and I think Colleen Patrick Goodrow has something to say about that. But it is a paradox that feels a little bit like that. We need the imagination to create the world. And yet in this world, how do we get the imagination? So I think the answer to this paradox is that both must happen together. It's a process. So what Marcuse calls the needs and faculties of freedom cannot be assumed to miraculously appear once new social institutions have been created. Rather, they will emerge as a part of the process of creating these institutions. And I hope people don't think that I'm trying to create a sort of get-out for myself here. I do know what I'm talking about, I'm just having trouble explaining it. What I mean is, well, let me give you some practical examples of what I mean. The process of creating new ways of relating to each other, that will open up new revolutionary possibilities. A practical example of what I mean, for example, about redefining our world, is one time when me and a friend of mine, we were in Tesco's. Before Everyone Hates Me, we weren't buying stuff. We shoplifted enormous amounts of food from Tesco's, and we would go around giving it to homeless and hungry folks. And what's important, I think, about that, and I'll give you another anecdote to illustrate my point further, is that when you do something like that, which I consider to be both a personal choice and a revolutionary form of revolutionary action, you can feel something change. It's like socially defined categories of right and wrong are revealed in all their artificiality, and the boundaries confining possibilities have shifted. It's like, that's actually something we're going to discuss more in the workshop, but this is something you don't do. This is something that's wrong, and even if you're willing to ignore the fact that it's wrong, it's impossible, but it just happened. And it not only happens when people are less hungry who weren't going to eat today because it happened. And that feels really different. And I have to say, even though I'm now all over the internet as a shoplifter and I will never go into Tesco's ever again, it feels really great. Another example of that is when I and some friends used to regularly get together to go dumpster diving, and we would basically live off dumpster diving. And one time we had we tried to have, most of us abandoned this towards the end, I have to say, and I will show off and say I'm one of the ones who didn't, but we had a no other option week, which is kind of like a buy nothing day, only extended. So our rule was, if it didn't come out of a dumpster, you don't eat it. And I regard that as another instance of stretching possibilities, because it did feel amazing. Even though I got home on one occasion at 4:30 in the morning and had to get up at 7 a.m. for college, it still felt amazing, because here we have our kitchen full of food, really good food that was going to waste. The capitalist system chucked it out. The capitalist system chucked it out while people are dying of hunger. And our kitchen is full of food because we refuse to accept all their definitions. This food is 2 minutes past its sell-by date, so we'll throw it in the trash. You don't go and get stuff out of the trash because you have to buy it off our shelves, because you have to pay for the right to eat. And once we did that small part, that really small, but for us important part of the Great Refusal, once we took back that bit of power, it feels really good. And I maintain that something changes. I think it's the same. In this context, I want to go into some false boundaries we create. I think it's the same with activism. For example, sad to say, a lot of the time activism kind of works as therapy for some people. And I have some tragic anecdotes for you on that score from my personal experience as well. But a lot of events become symbolic. It's like something happened somewhere. And okay, it happened, but it didn't meet with complete docile silence. But we forget where our action is going, and that was the case with me. It's like I probably come across as a real hypocrite to a lot of people here, because what am I doing right now? I mean, I'm actually recovering from a spell in hospital, and at the moment I have various restrictions, which mean that in terms of action there's not a lot I can do. But I hope I'm using that time well, and in some senses in line with my understanding of the Great Refusal. I used it, for example, to take some women's self-defence courses. I'm using it to do a hell of a lot of reading. But when I first came to activism, I was pretty much, I was pretty much the poster person for everything you shouldn't do, because I was really angry, and basically my activism was directionless anger, and I got arrested repeatedly for things I can't even understand why I did now. Again, that's something we'll go into in more depth in the direct action workshop, but either I was stupid, like getting caught on minor criminal damage charges for things that were not worth that risk, or my actions were symbolic, like walking into a meeting with a megaphone, disrupting that meeting. And I remember on one occasion somebody actually asked me after I got out of a holding cell, what did you hope would happen? And I actually had to think about that. And I ended up saying, somebody will wonder why this person cared enough to get arrested about that. And that was really naive. The system doesn't care. One person can get arrested 50 times, nobody cares. And that's the problem with symbolic action. Going slightly off the point, that is one of the major dangers of symbolic action. Nobody cares. And ultimately it's reformist, because we're floundering around asking people to help us. Nobody is going to help us. Nobody is going to help us except ourselves. All this is an effort to influence people. For example, the meeting I disrupted was an AstraZeneca meeting. So I walked in with a megaphone and made a huge fuss, got arrested. You get the picture. What did I hope would happen? Did I hope that they're going to suddenly grow consciences and drop HLS? Do I want them to drop HLS? What will that achieve in the grand scheme of things? But I was really directionlessly angry in those days. And what that comes back to, in terms of what I'm trying to say here, is this divide between theory and practice. As I'm going to point out in the workshop, lost the handouts by the way, Enrico Malatesta, his definition of revolution was intelligent direct action. That's what was missing from what I was doing. And one of the central strands of Marcuse's thought, and this is where it's relevant to us, when we look at our movement today, all our movements, all our fractured, confused movements, we've either forgotten about the direct action part and we're sitting pontificating, or we've forgotten about the intelligent part and we're running around getting arrested. And either of those on their own will kill the movement. Directionless action will kill the movement. So will thought without action. And this is where Marcuse actually said, knowledge is transformative, it is political. So we need to take that transformative political knowledge that we've got from experience and from sharing, because it doesn't happen in a void. This is both an essential point of Marcuse's theory and it's an essential strand of anarchist thought. That knowledge, thought, theory, and action and activism and what happens on the streets, they're essential parts of one dynamic whole. You can't have revolution with one and not the other. So, with that in mind, I'm wondering if there's anything I haven't covered before I get on to repressive tolerance. One thing I haven't covered, I think, and I should have touched on it when I was talking about shoplifting, is how consumer culture as social control. This is one aspect of Marcuse's complete disillusionment with classical Marxism, because he saw that consumer culture, like when he was in the US, consumer culture had replaced traditional concepts of capitalist tyranny in working class minds with this superficially more comfortable form of tyranny. And it was so insidious that people stopped noticing that it was tyranny. And Marcuse recognised that Marx had misdiagnosed the causes of oppression and their remedies. I think it's said, actually, that Marcuse was always fonder of Marx's writings when he was younger because he was more idealistic. And Marx, forgivably, gets really, really fed up in his later writings. But that's one thing Marcuse didn't do. He didn't stay optimistic, but he stayed hopeful. He still believed. And that's because he understood that the revolutionary class that Marx had identified, the working class, had been disarmed, they'd been neutralised, and they'd been neutralised by consumer culture. And I think that's true of all of us, to a greater or lesser extent. None of us here, definitely me included, can say we're not guilty of being neutralised in our great refusals in our own lives by consumer culture. We all are. Actually, a tragic example of this in my case is when I lost my iPod in the park. As everybody here may have guessed, I didn't pay for the iPod, but I lost it in the park. And yeah, when I did that, I said bravely, it doesn't matter, because it's, what is that if not one of Marcuse's false needs? This is a need created by capitalism, so I will buy an iPod, so I can do without it. And for an agonising length of time, until I got a new iPod, if I wanted to hear music, I had to get my guitar and play my own music. And that was a really salutary lesson, actually, because it does show you how insidious it is. On a serious note, it does. Because we are going to go into the potentially elitist nature of shoplifting, by the way. I am lucky because I've repeatedly got away with it, but not everyone is in the position to nick an iPod, so not everybody would nick an iPod, even if they could. So you get a situation where you are repeatedly buying iPods. And this is a concept we're going to go into, and I'm going to give you a tortuously complicated and threatening handout on this. It's called planned obsolescence, which is basically capitalists keep producing stuff so that it will either fall to bits or go out of fashion and you'll have to buy another one. And this is pretty much symptomatic of the whole capitalist scheme. Keep you buying, keep you working so you can buy. Keep you buying so you can live. And it's just a cycle of tyranny. I was watching a speech given by Angela Davis, awesome person, possible vegan, claims she is, need to verify that, and pupil of Marcuse, and her speech was called How Does Change Happen? And one of the things she said is that ordinary people became collectively aware of themselves as potential agents of social change, and they learned how to adopt a critical stance on their relationships with reality. So, basically what they're saying is that what's being said by that is that when we submit to the inevitability of the state's version of reality, we've missed the chance to define our own reality. We're admitting to our own lack of belief in our vision. Part of the Great Refusal is a complete rejection of the normalisation of violence and repression. This means, for example, the rejection of the right of armed gangs to assault and imprison other people because the gang members wear a certain uniform and have the backing of the state, for example. Because in this society, outsiders are stereotyped and used as affirmation of the normality of the established order. And our questions say something about us, not about the order we question. But we can use this, we can make them irrelevant, we can use this to question the legitimacy of their fake truth, as we fight to create a world from whose values we will not be alienated, in which we will not be outcasts, in which we will not be caricatured as some warning of what happens if you step out of line. Because right now the system thinks we are illogical, and it's capitalism itself which is dangerously illogical. It's capitalism where, to quote Marcuse yet again, you don't need to read his books now, do you? Exchange value, not truth value, counts. But what I think, to finish up with, before we start the workshop, Q&A, etc., etc., maybe we have the final say on what's real. Because think about the ways in which we create our own realities. We've never seen and never lived in utopia. We can learn to imagine it. I'm sure we've all felt, in our moments of most loving, determined, uncompromising refusal, some fragments of how it would feel. Think, for example, of the joyous car-free space we create when we join together for a critical mass bike ride. That's as real as the traffic jams of empty people on their way to jobs they hate at the beginning of another identical day. A sanctuary where the birds have dust baths in the sun and goats and calves play together, that's as real as a battery unit or an abattoir. Safe, gentle intimacy is as real as rain. Our social centres and safe spaces are as real as prison cells. These are our realities, which we as revolutionaries have created among ourselves in defiance of the system's lying definitions of truth. We know that for the moment the misery and oppression of their realities far outweigh that of ours. But if we don't turn away from them, they have the potential to be more powerful and important than the repressive, deadening realities that have been imposed upon us. When they perform their atrocities and define us against that normalised violence as abnormal, we will have the power to expose that definition as the fabrication it is. When they mock our rebellions by claiming the injustice we fight against is just the way things are or have always been, we will be able to say, not in our world. So, as my almost final word on this, I would say, everybody, don't be disillusioned. Because if we don't keep our dreams, we are going to lose them. And I have so many other things I wanted to say, but I'm aware we're running out of time here. I'm just looking in despair at all my notes and thinking of all the things I'm not going to be able to say. But I think my final word is, how I understand the Great Refusal is an act of profound, creative, uncompromising rebellion. And this workshop is going to be about how to make that a reality, a new reality, not an old one. A lot of people say in response to these ideas that that's all talk, that's impossible in the real world. But I am unashamedly an idealist. Marcuse believed in the power of the imagination to create a gentler world. And right now I believe in the power of our movement and the power of the community and solidarity we can create together to prove him right. Thanks, folks.